Welcome to Coping Together, Mental Health Association of Central Florida's live web series dedicated to helping you develop coping strategies and wellness tools related to COVID-19, as well as talk about mental health. Coping Together was created in response to COVID-19's mandatory social distancing orders. This show seeks to learn and educate. We do not speak for any particular group. Overall, Coping Together serves as a platform through which we can demystify and unpack mental health concepts and hear from experts in the field. Please note that this show may discuss sensitive topics including but not limited to sexual assault, suicide, and various traumas. If you find yourself feeling upset or struggling during any episode, listen to your body and pause the input. We will post related resources. Remember, it's okay to get help.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Coping Together series from the Mental Health Association of Central Florida. We're pleased to have you join us again for the important topic that we're talking about today, which is the back-to-school transition for parents and children. There's a lot of information going around about how to address some of the concerns that have naturally arisen. There's a lot of misperceptions, I think, about some of the confusing new rules that are in place related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm pleased to have with us today Dr. Shainna Ali with Integrated Counseling to help us kind of navigate some of the information, some of the things that we think we might want to share with parents as they transition to this new experience that many of us have not had for close to 17 months. I know as a parent myself, my daughter has been at home in the launch ed model here in Orange County, and I've got my own anxieties. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Shainna, tell us a little bit about your experiences, your background, and then we'll transition into our topic.
Marni, first of all, thank you so much for having me. As you mentioned, I absolutely agree with you. This is a really important conversation, so I'm honored to be here chatting with you about this. And it's timely. It's like kind of ironic to say that it's timely because it's not new, but it's very important as we embark on a new school year. So thank you for that. As you mentioned, I practice at Integrated Counseling Solutions. That is a practice that I own in downtown Orlando. I identify as a counselor, educator, and advocate. And some of my areas of interest are some of the areas that are really pertinent to this conversation, such as anxiety, development, and especially self-care and well-being. So I'm really happy to have this conversation with you.
Well, thank you again for joining us. I want to preface before we begin, because I want to encourage individuals that are joining us today to share questions or comments that they might have, but we're not going to address them directly in the chat feature during the program. So I'd like to provide you with an email address that you can send those questions to, and we'll get back to you individually. So send those directly to me at Stallman, STAHLMAN, at MHACF.org. And I'll try to address those, and Shainna will try to address those going forward. So thank you for that. So Shainna, let's begin. And I think a good place to start with is, we've seen over the last 17 to 18 months, lots of our articles, lots of anecdotal information being discussed about the fears and anxieties, phobias even, that have developed amongst children regarding COVID-19. Let's spend a couple minutes unpacking that and talking about how those arise and how you may have seen them reflected in your practice with some of your patients.
You know, Marni, I remember thinking back to the beginning of the pandemic, before lockdown measures were in place, and speaking with lots of my colleagues in Orlando, and everyone knew that this was going to take a tremendous influence on mental health. As you noted, there have been many studies and statistics that have popped out that unfortunately confirm that. And I would say that in my practice, and again, speaking with colleagues, it absolutely has confirmed that. You mentioned children, and I think it's interesting because yes, it has affected children in a new way that we have not really had to experience before, but you have this taking space at the same time with young adults, with parents, with grandparents. So we have this unique experience that we're all experiencing together, but everyone is experiencing it in different ways. So there are some similarities. So perhaps, you mentioned, and I appreciate your transparency of the anxieties you have. I absolutely have had anxieties. I actually dealt with pregnancy in the pandemic, which gave unique anxieties for medical reasons, of course. And now we're also relating, but also not relating. So you have some people developing phobias, some people experiencing depression for the first time. So it's a really unique time in our history to have our individual experiences, regardless of lifespan, and also dealing with this with people that we care about, our family members, community members. And that's a lot for anybody to hold.
It is. And I think that one of the things I've seen with my own daughter and talked with, friends and colleagues with children of their own is that the expression of those anxieties, those phobias about their personal safety, their health and hygiene, really are individually expressed very uniquely. And I think one of the things that has, as you've noted, this has also occurred and transpired with young adults, with seniors. It doesn't discriminate by age. And I have noted, and as lots of parenting tips have always said, be careful what you're saying around your children, no matter how young they may be, because there's really no way to really judge and know how much they're absorbing, and how much they actually might even understand. For some of the younger children that some parents may be viewing in today, they may be assuming, oh, they're so young, they can't comprehend the content of what we're discussing. But they can pick up on the body language. They can pick up on the physical manifestations of stress and anxieties that we naturally emulate when those are occurring for us. And I know, again, as a mom, and now I'm sure as you as a new mom will know soon enough, our children are really mirrors when we hold them up to ourselves. They're there watching in a concentrated way. What are your thoughts about that for some of the people watching today?
First of all, I wholeheartedly agree from a personal and professional stance. I've definitely seen times that, let's take parents for a standpoint, are dealing with their own mental health, understandably so, but assume that their child is unaffected by what they are affected by. And this is a year that has made that particularly hard, and I think that we're still facing that. So it's important to assume that they're absorbing something. We just don't know what they're absorbing, how they're regulating or processing, but it's better safe to assume that they're absorbing something. Like you mentioned, little ones. Little ones are not able to regulate independently. So that doesn't mean that they're not absorbing the energy. You mentioned body language, but even if you're trying to keep your body language straight and pretend I'm not anxious, they can pick up on vibrations in a way that kind of as adults we have learned to tune out. So definitely assume that your children are picking them up. For little ones, you can still model if you're noticing yourself getting anxious. Maybe it's a moment to take a breath. Maybe it's a moment to take a break altogether. Maybe it's a moment to step outside if you have that. Do you have plants that you could spend some time watering together? So modeling is key. I know if you hear like, oh, my children are absorbing everything, that could be really intimidating and overwhelming, but there's opportunity there. So that's the little ones. And then you think about the older children. So middle school and older for sure, you can at least encourage some of these conversations, right? Being attuned to your children, noticing, especially if there's any dynamic shift of, I notice you're doing this a lot more, and encouraging that conversation, modeling that behavior again for coping, but also just doing it together as a family. There's opportunity there. And please don't write off your older children, right? So even if there are grandparents listening in talking about adult children, there's still an opportunity there to bond, because then you can verbally express, communicate, and support in a way that obviously you're unable to do for younger years.
I think that's really critical, that last part that you've just talked about, because part of modeling isn't just good physical behavior, but it's also good social emotional behavior. When we talk about how we express ourselves and how we come to terms with our own fears and anxieties, helping your child, regardless of their age span, understand and realize that there's appropriate ways for you to express yourselves, but also to be seen as vulnerable. I know as a parent early on in my parenting career, it was, I have to be superwoman strong. I cannot let anybody see that I have, a crack in the armor, which is devastating when something really important happens and you're not able to handle it, because that's not who we are. And that's not appropriate to consider women to assume a role of. But I've noticed as my own child has matured and gotten older, the conversations that we can have where I can say to her, I don't actually always know that answer. I don't always feel happy. There are days that I don't feel okay. This is how I manage it, and have that conversation. So, I had a conversation recently with someone where, especially as women, we were taught very early on that the word selfish is a bad word. And now we're talking, and this is maybe a good transition for us to talk about self-care as a parent. Because if we're going to help our kids transition through this very difficult and anxiety-provoking time, don't we, do you think, as parents, deserve and need to know elements of our own self-care so that we can model and help our children learn that?
Absolutely. And I want to start out by even just that word self-care. When you noticed it, for everybody that's listening in, I want you to think back to what your visceral reaction was when Marni mentioned self-care, right? Because I'm imagining there's a broad spectrum of reactions. Some people may say, that is not for me. I don't need that. As you noted, it's selfish, right? We might have that category. It's really common for folks to think, listen, I cannot get on a plane and travel somewhere or spend a lot of money or leave my family right now. The school year is beginning. Then there's also folks who believe, that's just not important at all across the board, whether I can afford it or not. And then finally, you might have some folks here, and I'm really hoping that this is the biggest group, or at least will become the biggest group by the end of our conversation together. That is, yes, self-care is important for me, for my children, for my family, for our community. And I want to talk about that first. So I want to acknowledge that these are really important to recognize if you're having these reactions, because they can serve as blocks, all of those former reactions. And I think self-care gets misunderstood. All we're asking is to consider what your needs are in the current context in order to take care of yourself, to better take care of others as well. So there really is nothing selfish about that when you break it down. It is really, especially if we're talking to a lot of parents right now, it's kind of our parental obligation, right? And even if you're not a parent and you're supporting or a teacher or whatever other role, you still have an important role in our community. So we all need to play our parts in that way. Now, I understand it's easier said than done. I understand that marketing strategies have made self-care seem like this upper echelon thing that only certain people can achieve. And I truly believe that that is not the case. So if we introduce a holistic model of wellness, that is not just physical well-being, that is not just mental well-being, but there are all sorts of comprehensive domains that are important to you. Maybe that's familial, maybe that's spiritual, maybe that's intellectual, maybe it's career. Whatever those domains are, thinking about what your needs are in those categories and what can you tangibly do first by yourself. But in this conversation, I think it's exciting to introduce the notion that you don't have to do it by yourself, right? So if I recognize that for my emotional wellness, meditation is important, then I don't always have to meditate by myself. Perhaps I go to, especially now there's some really awesome virtual classes, a virtual class with other people, right? So I think that's really important to recognize that self-care absolutely is not selfish. And in a time that is so stressful like this one, and there's so many unknowns, we need it now more than ever.
I can't agree with you more. And I'm so appreciative that you've discussed this. There's really a continuum of different elements that come into self-care. And when I was having this conversation recently with a friend, I said, when we fly on a plane and they go through the safety manual before you take off, the very first thing they say is, in the event of cabin depressurization, masks will drop. Please put it on yourself first before putting it on somebody else. And the why for that is, if you're not breathing, you can't help the person next to you. And so I really think that that's an incredible metaphor for, our cabin has been depressurized now for, as I said, about 18 months. And With the Delta variant on board now, some of the concerns that have been rising here in our local communities and across the country, we're seeing elevated levels, we're seeing more hospitalizations. This opportunity to really talk to individuals about self-care also may mean get vaccinated and practice good care with masking and social distancing, which is our next really good transition point to talk about as we go back to school. There's been a lot of misinformation out there, especially in the last week or so, about what can be done when the kids are back at school physically, and what are the obligations that the school districts have in maintaining that safety. So let me just pause for just a second and say that, yes, our governor did sign an executive order within the last week that says that masks are not mandatory for children, but within the purviews of our school districts, they have the ability to still mask mandate for their employees and guests that might be coming on campus. And that has happened in several of our local school districts in Seminole, Orange, and Osceola counties. Check with your local school that you're returning to. Another question that has come up is about whether or not you can inquire if someone's been vaccinated, like your child's teacher. You cannot. That's a safe and health concern that's private to them. But they can still practice good and will be practicing good safety protocols in the classroom with distancing. Schools will have masks available. And this is a really maybe good transition to our next area here, which is there are going to be some families that steadfastly will say masking is for us, for safety. And then there are going to be other families that are going to say, we're not going to mask. And so there's going to be a dichotomy when these kids come back. We may message in our household, we mask. And when they get there, they're going to see peers that may not. How does that get managed for the kids in their relationships? How does maybe bullying come into effect? Someone bullying because they're not masked, someone bullying because they are masked. There's a lot of dynamics here.
Absolutely. And I think those dynamics, I wish I could say that this is the only context that it exists in, but absolutely that exists beyond the school system too. It's happening larger with neighbors, right? So knowing that that friction exists, once again, gives more importance to that area of self-care, but also familial home self-care, right? So checking in with your children, we think that it's possible that could happen. We know that there's going to be difference in opinions, discussions, what they observe, what they see. As we talked about earlier, we can model for children, but when you go to school, everybody else is modeling for them as well, right? So I think these conversations, if they haven't already, need to begin and need to remain continuous. Of course, we know that younger ones will not be able to comprehend as much to have that dialogue, but at least our responsibility is to understand that we're checking in with our children and making sure we're helping to make sure that they are as well as possible, and that includes facilitating their self-care, right? For older children, you might be able to have some of these dynamic conversations and understand and explain. I've heard that this has become a really helpful lesson in science for lots of families to have with older children. It's kind of taking the classroom into real life. So there's an opportunity there as well. So I think most importantly, my view as a mental health professional is that these conversations need to happen.
Yeah, and as you pointed out so correctly, bullying is pervasive regardless if we're in a pandemic or not. And so some of the elements that we're maybe giving as examples here, regardless if it's about masking or not masking, there are some fundamental things that parents can start to have conversations with their child about how to manage a bullying experience, how to manage their own stresses and anxieties that may not be related to the pandemic at all. It could be related to them having a learning disability. My daughter is dyslexic. When she was in 3rd grade, a trip to the library was just the most terrifying experience that she could relate. Mom, I don't want to go. They're going to know I can't read. Everybody will be over in the chapter book section. And that was an opportunity to have and sit down long conversations. And that's, I think, an important point here. I'd love for you to spend more time on. These are not one-offs. These are continual. So talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. And I even hear, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that the average parent tuning in who may not feel as comfortable with managing these conversations may think, okay, I understand why this is important, but I don't know where to begin. I haven't had those conversations before. On one hand, I say, just start having them, right? And before you bring this into your, at your dinner table, first, make sure you're reflecting for yourself, right? So where do you stand? Why do you stand there? What's going on with your emotions? Again, we have the responsibility to regulate, so our children are not made responsible for regulating our emotions, right? So check yourself first, have those conversations, do your research. But also I want to acknowledge that this is a lot for anyone to carry, and having these conversations, you might start thinking about your own anxiety and you realize, I don't know how to manage this. Deep breathing's not working. All the things everybody says is not, it just doesn't suffice. And I think that's a really important point to recognize why the Mental Health Association of Central Florida exists, is you don't have to do it alone. And I think a lot of people have been super courageous during this time, acknowledging that humility and using that community care to recognize, all right, I'm coming into some obstacles here. That's where counseling comes in, right? And in many forms, and I'll turn that back to you to talk better about the services that may be a better fit. But I would say even just individual counseling, family counseling, support groups, and a lot of these are occurring virtually as well. So it's amenable.
And the conversation couldn't be more timely. We're coming off of 2 weeks of the Olympics, and we've seen at least 4 athletes, premier, just elite individuals at the top of their physical forms. Simone Biles, Noah Lyles, that I'm coming to think of. These are individuals that have made an incredible statement that even Michael Phelps, I'm struggling. I'm okay to say I'm not okay, which is what we say here at the Mental Health Association, but going even further than that by expressing why they're not okay, and the self-care element that they have said is essential, that that barometer internally has said to them, I know I need to take care of myself. I'm going to pull myself away from this incredible activity that the entire world is looking at me, and take care of myself. There's been quite an enormous reaction about the destigmatization now that we are seeing when individuals like that come forward. And I'm wondering if there's a way to translate those large global event experiences that we've seen in the news down to some practical tips for parents that may be with us today.
Well, there are 2 things that I think that are important for conversation topics that can come up. Like you mentioned, the Olympics are happening. This has a mental health theme. That's a nice way to segue in at the dinner table, right? And say, did you hear about Simone Biles? Explaining it, especially if the child is old enough. Of course, we're keeping that caveat that the child can understand, and talking through that, right? Because this is another, more neutral to the pandemic, but another place that there may be a lot of varied opinions on, right? So let's say, for example, you bring a topic like this up and your child explores, well, I guess that person is weak, or they're not as strong as I thought, or they're not as great of an athlete as I thought. And that's a really wonderful time for you to step in and shift the paradigm and the perception of what mental health is, right? So I just think about it as athletes, if we're using that as an example, are actually really mentally strong. If you think about the training, and if we're talking about folks who are going back to school, you might have a little athlete of your own or you were an athlete once when you were in school. So many folks can relate to that idea of the mental stamina that it takes, also the endurance and resilience, mental and physical. And to think that even someone who has done all of this to be mentally well still goes through struggles as well. That is a really helpful angle to normalize how pervasive and common mental health struggles are. Instead of thinking this happens to a certain type of person, we need to go ahead and dispel that stigma and just acknowledge that we're all going to have mental health problems at one point or time. I'm not saying everyone's going to have a diagnosis, but some sort of problem. And this pandemic has definitely taught us that. So that's a good way to just kind of bring current events in and speak. And it doesn't always have to be about the pandemic. I think that's a wonderful example. And also
that I hear you saying that we're human beings, and I remember my own parents, people that I know, I think I may have, and I'm sure I have said it in my own time as a parent, just push through it. You can do it. Let's put aside what you're telling me is your anxiety or your obstacle, because we have a need to get to the finish. We have a need to say we're done, we've accomplished that. But we don't think about the journey or the trail in between the beginning and the end. And for even younger children, I think that that's a really important component. Maybe talk a little bit further there, because it seems like that's where you were going.
Absolutely. And part of that is acknowledging where we may have core beliefs that come from our own families, from our cultures, from our communities that have now become internalized and are coming back into, and we're continuing it for generations and generations. But this is a wonderful time to stop and reflect and think about what beliefs do we have that don't align with mental wellness, that as parents or any adult really can take a moment to stop and think about in order to shift that paradigm and create a healthy grounding for children. So I think that is important. Some folks can do that independently, that type of reflection. It's a nice conversation to have. I think about couples even, right? So you don't have to, if you are coupled and parenting, that's a really wonderful opportunity. If you have other friends or family members who are also dealing with this, use your community to have these conversations. But again, I want to normalize that it's really difficult to have those conversations, especially for the first time by yourself or with folks who are untrained, and turn to therapy for that. That's why counselors are there.
I love the fact that you've brought in the word cultural, because cultural competency, cultural awareness, we're really talking that within different communities, there are different approaches. And we need to have that sensitivity, that the biases that we may have about how one cultural component of our community may be managing this is not the same. And so maybe that's an opportunity for us to have another session to talk about cultural competency and parenting intersecting that, because this is not a, everything you needed to know about being pregnant book. This is, or being a parent book. And I think it's really important that we all are aware and talk about the fact that within your own community, who may be with us today or watching further, there's unique things that need to be paid attention to, and that this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's really where the Mental Health Association can come in getting you connected with support groups, specifically individual counselors and therapies that you may be interested or want to pursue. Or as you mentioned, when we're dealing with individuals that may have an actual behavioral health diagnosis, how to medically manage that, because this is a medical condition, and it's not an indictment of someone's intellectual or personality they're managing. So we're nearing coming to the end, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of wrap up. What, if any, maybe are some other tips? I know we've talked about daily routines and personal safety, and understanding our own fears and anxieties of parents. Have we left anything out? I'm sure we could keep talking, I'm sure, for a long time.
We could have a whole session on coping skills, but I also want to empower everyone listening to, instead of just listening to me kind of mouth off a bunch of coping skills that may or may not work for you, think about the coping skills that you may have used by history, or even you just recently started using, that you may not have thought of as coping skills, but they're already there in your coping toolkit ready to go because they work for you, right? So I remember a little bit ago I was saying about wellness and thinking about that it is more integrated than just being physical or just mental. Thinking about what makes up your wellness, that reflection can be coping in and of itself. But then once you have these different areas, then you will know what your needs are in those areas and what you can do in those areas, right? So for example, for physical well-being, being able to have the privilege of having your physical needs met is key. It's as simple as hydration, but quality rest and making sure that your family stays safe and healthy.
Oh, sleeping. Wouldn't that be something?
Listen, I don't sleep right now, but I'm doing my best, right? Because it is still a foundational need and affects us on many levels. Mental, I know we talked about conversation topics, making sure you seek help if needed. Digital is a realm that we often kind of miss. And what's interesting about the pandemic, it's made us all more virtual space. I mean, look at us in 2 different offices meeting to record this.
Right.
So coming up with what those digital boundaries are, turning your phone on do not disturb or off, or giving yourself a full day with no devices.
Oh, I love that, because we are so inundated with information that I know my own husband, he's like, I cannot do anymore. I have reached my limit, because we, as human beings, we're not equipped to create the filters to compartmentalize all of this. And so this 24-hour news cycle, information at our fingertips, you know, this lovely iPhone that we all are glued to, and the streams of information that come through it, I couldn't agree more that I think probably the best thing, and this is also true to practice with your children, again, as a mom with a 13-year-old and an iPhone, is it's off. Shut it off. And really re-engage with people and your environment instead of this one-dimensional information bombardment that our brain is just, you know, evolutionarily, I don't think we've been equipped to process.
We haven't, and there's a lot of studies on why it's overwhelming for us and why we have almost like an addictive quality when it comes to devices and being tethered to them. But I also want to normalize that the pandemic made digital boundaries harder than ever, because it increased our need to be meeting via Zoom or FaceTiming with our loved ones that we can't see. So it makes it more complicated. So I want to also normalize that I know sometimes like, just turn your phone off, and it is not easy. So, but that process of realizing that this is what our needs are as an individual, but as a family, as a community, and how do we meet those needs? That is the process of self-care. So like I mentioned, I could go on and on. I don't want to bore everybody about coping skills, but you're right. I think that there's a lot to talk about here, and I'm hoping we have some really helpful questions that we could then answer in the future to make sure we are trying to do our best to help our, you know, community members stay mentally well in this time.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up for today, but I want to give our viewers and our community, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
Great question. So if you want to email me directly, especially if there are questions about today that perhaps we can answer next time, you can reach me at hello@drshainna.com. So that's hello@drshainna.com. Or you can also find me, the most active social platform that I have is Instagram @Dr.
Wonderful. I can't tell you how important I think this topic is. I think we're going to need to continue and have something regularly. So for our viewers watching in our Coping Together series, stay tuned to our social media channels to look for the next installment. I think that this could go on indefinitely, as we have such a wide variety of different topics. Hopefully the community today has found a basis of some good points and informations that can help them during this transition. Tomorrow is the start of school, August 10th. I'll be out with my daughter, dropping her off at her middle school, and I'll be thinking about some of the things we've talked about today, even as a mental health professional myself. You know, there's an old saying, sometimes the shoemaker's son goes shoeless. So thank you, Shainna, for pointing out some of these things, reminding me, and for individuals, again, that want to reach out and get more information or connect with us, Find us through our social media channels. Call us at our office, 407-898-0110, and we can connect you with a counselor, an intern that can help navigate for you. Thank you again for joining us today for this Coping Together series. Good luck, parents, tomorrow. To all the children out there, be safe, and we'll see you again real soon. Thanks so much.